And with that, I'll turn it back to Paola to talk about Broken Nature, the exhibition that has inspired this podcast, and that is really the basis for this session.
Thank you, Anna. Many of you know about a previous exhibition, Items is Fashion Modern. That's why you joined the course of Fashion as Design. But there's another exhibition that intervened after Items that is called Broken Nature. And over the past several months, Anna and I have worked on it and installed it at the museum. Broken Nature is a collaboration between MoMA and the Triennale di Milano, the city where I'm from, and a version of the exhibition opened to the public at MoMA just a couple of weeks ago. But the larger installation, which I also curated in 2019 with a team composed of Ala Tannier, Laura Mairan, and Nerica Petrillo, opened at the Triennale di Milano in 2019. The show, both the bigger version and the version at MoMA, explored the idea of restorative design and proposes strategies to help humans repair their relationship to the environments that they share with other species and with each other. The most important aspect of the idea of restorative design is the fact that it shows that we humans can be responsible, can be mindful, respectful, without having to sacrifice the pleasure, aesthetic, and intellectual that we know comes from doing design, from using design, and from thinking of design. So restorative design is one step further. And one of the other aspects of Broken Nature, the exhibition is a 4-part podcast that explores topics like food and, of course, fashion. And you can download it anytime, wherever you get your podcast, or you can go on MoMA magazine and get more information. The podcast would not have been possible without Anna's research. She did it all. And her vision and support just keep it standing. And it's really outstanding. So I hope you'll check it out. And I would like to invite her to share a little bit more about the process of putting together this podcast and what's behind it. Anna, on to you.
Thanks, Paola. Mike, can we go to the next slide, please? So as Paola mentioned, the Broken Nature podcast series really is inspired and derives from the Broken Nature exhibition. We worked on this project with our colleagues in the creative team, and it was really them who came to us and said, we would like to expand the reach of Broken Nature. We, of course, opened the show in the middle of the pandemic. We knew that not a lot of people would be able to come to New York and see it. And so we were eager to sort of like explore the themes that are touched upon in Broken Nature through a new medium, which is a podcast. I know that I also speak for Paola when I say that it's the first time that we've done something like this. It was very exciting. And so we decided to focus the podcast on the idea of systems and the idea of systems through the lens of design. So each one of the episodes of the podcast looks at one of the most important systems that permeate our lives, from food, from our body, from the law to the law, and of course, fashion, which is what we will focus on today, given the focus of the MOOC and fashion as design. And so for the fashion episode, we decided to start by focusing on this idea of circularity. What is circular fashion, and is it actually a sustainable way to approach a very fraught system? And if so, can we think about circularity in a way that allows us to redesign that system? And so we decided to focus particularly on the idea of secondhand and whether it is indeed a sustainable alternative to the system of fashion, both fast or slow. Each one of the podcast episodes starts with a question. There, for example, is corn feeding a lie? Who is a river? And in this case, should secondhand be our first choice? Next slide, please. And so for each episode of the podcast, we created a sort of 3-act structure. For the very first act, we really thought it was important to bring in a guest that would really speak to the larger problem itself. Why is it a problem, and why should we care, right? With secondhand, you know, we hear a lot about consignment, we hear a lot about resale as alternative and as really solutions to the wastefulness of the fashion industry. But you have to really take a sort of like wider lens look in order to understand whether this is actually true, and particularly who is being affected by these sort of like, by these things that are being sold off as solutions. And so we invited our first guest. His name is Andrew Brooks. He is a geographer and a lecturer at King's College in London. And most importantly, he wrote a book called Clothing Poverty: The Hidden World of Fast Fashion and Secondhand Clothing. We thought it was important to bring him in first so that we can really start with this very systematic view of fashion, right? For us, and this is a central idea in Broken Nature, the exhibition, design really plays a central role in helping citizens become more attuned to the complexity of the systems that inform our lives as individuals and as communities. And we need to really understand that these intangible infrastructures that surround us, for example, that are made up of policy, of trade routes, of legislation, they are also designed, and they also affect the way in which we behave, like all forms of design. And so the kind of first questions that we wanted to ask Andrew Brooks were, who really participates in the secondhand clothing market, who benefits from it, who suffers because of it? And the final question that we wanted to sort of kind of like start thinking about was, is it in fact a sustainable alternative to the excessive consumption encouraged by the system of fashion? Andrew Brooks starts his book, Clothing Poverty, by tracing the journey of a pair of jeans, right? And those of you who are taking the MOOC, Fashion as Design, can really understand why he chose jeans, right? They're incredibly ubiquitous. They have had a really long history, and their really meaning changes depending on the time period that we're talking about and who wears them, correct? And so he started his investigation by exploring the different stages of sort of this journey, beginning with design, which usually, and most of the time, in the jeans that we all wear, starts in countries like the US or Britain. For example, if we're talking about the Levi's 501, which is one of the items in items, and of course, something that's touched upon in the MOOC. They are designed in San Francisco, where Levi's is based. But that's where it becomes tricky, right? After San Francisco, when we start thinking about where the cotton is produced, that becomes really complicated. It can be in India, it can be in the American South, it can be in Bangladesh, where they're manufactured, of course. In the case of Levi's, it's usually in Mexico, but it could also happen in Bangladesh. So we start really seeing the complexity of the system, right? And the fact that there are a lot of stakeholders that either benefit or can be affected by this, because of course, the system of fashion is really one of the ones that most easily helps us understand the inequalities that exist in a globalized market, correct? And so by tracing this sort of journey, Andrew Brooks helps us really understand how complex it is, and how it becomes even, and in terms of labor issues, in terms of social issues, but also in terms of environmental issues. As a lot of you know, cotton requires a lot of water to grow. And cotton in itself has had a really fraught history in terms of colonialism. And that really is one of the sort of key beginnings of this really sort of fraught system. It is really based on a kind of colonial idea of cotton being produced in countries in the global South for the benefit of countries in the global North, right? And it becomes even trickier when we reach, you can kind of see on the left-hand side, this is an illustration that Andrew created to really, really make this point clearer. You can actually see it a little bit, sort of like a close-up of it on his website, which our team members will share in the chat. But it really shows how it becomes even much more problematic once we start thinking about what happens when the clothing is discarded, right? Because it's not only is it really hard to trace, it usually ends up being that most of the clothing that we donate in the global North ends up being sort of dumped on countries in the global South, particularly in South America and Africa. And Andrew in particular has conducted research in Mozambique and in other countries of Africa. And you can kind of see a photo here on the right-hand side of his field work in Kenya of a clothing market that's dedicated entirely to secondhand clothing that is brought from the global North, which in theory has been donated to charities like Oxfam or things like that. Next slide, please. And so we really brought him in to understand how this system had been designed. What is the legislation that allowed for this globalization and for this liberalization of a market that really does not protect everyone's interest, right? It usually protects a very specific type of interest. And so we spoke, for example, about the multi-fiber agreement, which was an international agreement that was set in place in 1974. That basically wanted to protect richer countries in the global north from a very sort of like rapid liberalization, but instead what it ended up doing is that it created a very sort of like overnight opening of the markets for countries in the global south without a lot of protection. And what it wanted to do basically, it was to change the way in which clothing was produced so that the sort of like know-how, the design aspect of it could be produced in sort of like the main cities in the global south, in the global north, sorry. But then the production economy, the production aspect of it would be relocated to places where obviously labor is cheaper. And that really, of course, not only led to a lot of injustices in terms of labor, but it's what sort of created this overpopulation of secondhand clothing in the global north. This, of course, taking into account the sort of like proliferation of fast fashion since the multi-fiber agreement came into place, right? So the more clothing we in the global north, people located in the global north, I'm actually from Colombia, but live here, purchase, and the more we donate, of course, that means the more is being dumped in countries in the global south. And so once we were able to sort of understand this really complex system, we wanted to sort of bring in people that were thinking about these issues from a more pragmatic way. How are people resisting? How are people reacting to this system? And so our second guest, and next slide, please, is fashion designer Katekani Moreku. He's based in South Africa. He's a really young designer. You can see his clothes on the right-hand side. He became well known for using secondhand clothing and discarded fabrics exclusively to create his garments in a really sort of wonderful and inventive way. When we spoke with him, he mentioned that he had been really inspired by his own Mapulana culture. The Mapulana is an ethnic group that lives in South Africa. And he mentioned that particularly the women of the Mapulana ethnic group, because they don't work, they really cannot afford to buy new clothing. And so for festivals and for special occasions, they will go and try to find, scraps of fabric, secondhand clothing to make them into these really beautiful outfits that you can see on the right-hand side. And so that for Katekani, who comes from this culture, was the most important sort of thing in his background. And he really kind of says that he copies what they do, not only because he finds it really inspiring, not only because for him it's environmentally positive, it's making an environmentally positive impact, but also because it's cheaper, right? You can more easily find secondhand clothing in South Africa for a cheaper price than you can new clothing. He started his career when he was a student, and so it was just much easier for him to go into garbage bins, for him to go into secondhand clothing markets and create these really beautiful deconstructed pieces. Next slide, please. And he really sort of encapsulates his practice through this quote that I find really beautiful, so I will read it. He says, "The past is taken from our generation to use for them. This is why I embark on a journey to take from the older generation and use it now to avoid taking from the future." He not only is thinking about the sort of environmental impact of fashion in general, but he's also kind of providing a sort of way of resisting, right? He's using sort of like this very unequal system of power to his advantage in a way that's incredibly innovative. Next slide, please. And so after we spoke with Katekani, who is very, very much using sort of like an example of a localized way of resistance, we wanted to speak with somebody who was thinking about it from a more sort of like business-oriented perspective, and also who was working within this system very intentionally to kind of change it in different ways. So we spoke with Julie Wainwright, the founder and CEO of The Real Real. And for those of you who don't know what the Real is, it is a consignment company that started in the US. Consignment basically means, for those of you who don't know, that you kind of like take your personal items and you give them away to either a thrift shop or a company. The Real focuses in particular on luxury consignment. That basically means that they sell clothing from high-end fashion houses like Gucci or Prada or Chanel. And she started really this business, not necessarily thinking about the kind of fraught and like the sort of failures of the fashion industry. She just saw it as a business opportunity when she understood that if you were able to sort of like market secondhand clothing in a way that looked sort of luxurious, it could be a really interesting and a really sort of like sustainable business. But as she continued doing it, she also understood that the sort of environmental aspect of it was important. So she tells us, for example, in general, 40% to 50% of everything a company makes in the fashion industry is in the landfill or burned. And so they've started, next slide, please. They've started using sort of like the very damaging impact of the fashion industry as a kind of marketing strategy as well, right? And so you can kind of see on the left-hand side here is, you know, they've become big enough now that they even have brick and mortar shops. They're bringing that back kind of, and they kind of market their clothing in a way that it doesn't even look like vintage. You know, you can kind of compare this store to like Beacon's Closet, something that we have here in New York, or it's completely different. It's a little bit more luxurious. But they've also started to partner with brands to sort of like try to make a sort of bigger change in the industry. And so, for example, you can see on the right-hand side, they've partnered with Gucci so that Gucci gives them some of their discarded clothing and to be sold exclusively on the Real. They've also working with stakeholders in France to change some of the laws that prevent from a lot of this sort of like discarded fabric and clothing to be burnt or be thrown in the landfill. So it's a different way to sort of like approach this system and to resist it, right? It's a way that's a bit more systematic, but at the same time, we really have to think about the sort of privileges that come from being a sort of like large company in the US. So, you know, one of the things that Julie had told us, and also Katekani in a way, but more importantly for Julie, is that in order for her business to be successful, she really needed to sort of like start changing people's mindsets about secondhand clothing to make it seem as something that's luxurious. Next slide, please. She basically told us that at the very beginning, secondhand and consignment was seen as something for people that didn't have money. And so she really wanted to change that discourse, right? But what does it mean for somebody like Julie to be able to sort of like change that discourse, and sort of like for us in the global north to be able to choose whether or not we buy into this secondhand clothing market, whereas people in Africa or Latin America are not able to choose because it's the only option that they have, just because they're being inundated with these clothes. And that really for us is what systems thinking means, to sort of like understand a broader view of all the different things that affect our lives, and understanding that they don't affect all of us equally. So that was basically it. Paola, I wonder if you want to add anything else, or if we should jump into
No, this was a perfect description of the whole, the gist of the podcast, and also the conversation that we can have. So we can start with the questions, and I see that there are some already that are coming. So could you speak more about what you mean by the global north, and what we can do as individuals to dismantle this binary of north and south? Oh, that's a gigantic question. You know, as always happens, a question of this magnitude is hard to answer in an easy, straightforward way, because there are so many different forces that come into play, from policies and legislations to international agreements to very simply not being self-centered and selfish, you know, because it's pretty much also what Anna was describing beforehand, this the multi-fiber agreement. was, we never know if it meant well or if it was already a way to kind of draw the power towards the global north. But there's another podcast episode, which is the one about food, that speaks about corn and the system of corn and tries to look at NAFTA. NAFTA is a very famous agreement that has happened between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, which turned out to be to the enormous advantage of the United States because it created a free flow of merchandise, but not of workers. So in other words, we can mean well, but a change has to happen at all scales. And it's very hard to know how this balance between the global north and global south can change. Do you have some considerations, Anna, about it too?
No, I mean, I agree with you. It's a really difficult question and it's quite complex. I should quickly note that when we say global north and global south, we are talking sort of about an economic and political distinction, not necessarily a geographical distinction. So just to sort of quickly clarify that for those of you who were wondering, or if you were not clear. And yes, indeed, I think one of the sort of like things that we wish to make clear in the podcast is that when we speak of systems, there is really not one single solution. And it is important to not sort of like pin solutions on individual choices, because then would be sort of like negating the kind of complexities of capitalism, right? So we, in the fashion podcast, but also as Paola was mentioning in the corn podcast, we really stress the need for regulation, of course, that takes into account the interests of all individuals. And that is, of course, complex in a world where companies are driving, as we mentioned with the multi-fiber agreement, companies are really driving these regulations. And when it comes to individual choices, I think one thing that Paola made really clear in Broken Nature is that even though they will not be the ones that bring on systemic change, and we cannot sort of like put that burden on individuals, they can help us tip the scale one way or another. Do you agree, Paola?
I completely agree. No, it's definitely true. So there's also, I was thinking, a series of economists right now that are proposing this mission-based or value-based economy. Now, of course, the world of economics is always split along lines that are quite definitive, between those that propose a free market and those instead that think that there should be more support of humans towards each other. But so there's a big discussion that's going on, and I think it's going to go on for quite a long time. But there's another really interesting question that I wanted to pose. So what do you think about the relationship between consumerism and sustainability? Even if something is produced as ethically and sustainably as it can we really buy our way to a better environment? There's so much production and consumerism prevalent in fashion. The pace at which we consume seems pretty dangerous. I also feel like a lot of sustainably produced items are priced much higher, which makes the whole concept of sustainability really inaccessible. This is a very good question and comment. And in Broken Nature, we were proposing many different strategies, from that of buying objects produced better to buying less and retaining more. So maybe investing in something more expensive that can be used for a long time, upcycling, recycling. So there's many different ways. But I agree that first and foremost, there is a conundrum at the basis of this all. Can we buy and be sustainable? So personally, I have banned that word consumer and consuming from my lexicon when I talk in a propositive way. When I describe the world, of course, there's consumerism, but I try to always think that in the future, if we stop talking about consumption, people will start thinking that anytime they're buying a new garment, they're not just buying it and consuming it, but rather adopting it, which comes with a different degree of responsibility and engagement, right? So you adopt objects and clothes and animals, and everything that you take into your life is an adoption and not anymore just a taking in or a consuming. So just by changing words, we can change behaviors, but it really is a big conundrum that about the relationship between buying and being sustainable. What do you think, Anna?
No, I agree. I fully agree with you. I think it's important also, again, to note what you just said, that there are a lot of different approaches and a lot of them, and we still also understanding that a lot of it falls not on our hands as consumers or as individuals, because we all belong to sort of like a capitalist system that has higher interests. And one thing that I think is interesting is in some of the podcast episodes, if you do sort of listen, particularly the corn and fashion, a lot of the kind of examples of resistance that we brought in and that were mentioned by some of the other guests is this idea of sort of like a more local approach to food or a more local approach to clothing, sort of like becoming more familiar with the way that your food is cooked and produced, becoming more familiar with the way in which your clothes are being produced and where they come from, and even trying to produce them yourself if you can. That of course comes with a lot of privilege, and a lot of not everybody's able to do this, and we're also not saying that this is necessarily the only solution that exists, but somebody like Katekani is kind of showing how you can kind of resist a system that might oppress us all in different ways, in ways that are inventive. And in the corn episode, we talk about how indigenous communities are creating seed banks to preserve the native corn varieties in Mexico that are being sort of like pushed to the brink of extinction because of the American system of yellow corn production. And so I think there are these sort of like small acts of resistance that, even though they won't necessarily change an entire system, they can really help us kind of, as we've said before, tip the scale.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, I completely agree with you. And there's a question that is quite that I wanted to address. Raul, you're asking, what do you think of the low quality replica market and its impact? I have to say, this is not really what we're discussing today. So I just wanted to clarify it with you. We're not discussing the market of copies and replicas. Quite the opposite. We're talking about understanding each object, each garment onto its own merit. And there's a comment from Nicole that says, when buying secondhand clothes, I usually pay special attention to where those clothes were made. So it's the opposite. It's about being more mindful and just more respectful of what goes into a garment. The market of replicas, I live at Canal and Broadway, so I'm in the thick of it. And it's very problematic because it's an ecosystem that sustains a whole that sustains really crime and exploitation and labor, and that can be really damaging to both our idea of sustainability and to brands. Now, of course, you'll tell me some brands are just way too expensive, and I agree. So maybe we'll have to find a medium, but that's not really what we're talking about. So just wanted to let you know. But there's another question from Fatima. What do you think about the relationship between fashion and architecture, and how one influences the other according to different countries and cultures? This is quite interesting. Do you want to tackle it, Anna? Do you want to go for it?
I feel like you could answer it better, but one thing that I will say,
okay.
Yeah, you say it first and then I'll compliment whatever, because I think you are the person to answer this.
Not really. I mean, I think that the relationship between fashion and architecture used to be stronger once upon a time. Right now, it's not as strong because the whole world has become less based on style and on certain movements. Once upon a time, there used to be movements, so there was a direct connection between, say, the style, architecture, and the fashion. Right now, it's a little bit of anything goes, and also the architectural world has changed tremendously. So I think that it used to be, there used to be a connection, and right now there's very little. Of course, both architects and fashion designers are interested in process and in materials, so they can exchange know-how and discoveries from that viewpoint, but the relationship is not in the formal sense anymore. What do you think, Anna?
I agree. I think what you just said about sort of like the idea of developing processes is really what at the moment seems more exciting and important to me. Obviously, Paola, you and I have spoken a lot about Neri Oxman, who produces sort of like develops processes that can be used for fashion. But I did want to sort of speak about this really exciting exhibition that I saw was given a Graham Foundation. And one of the curators is actually Felicia Davis, who is an architect that is included in our show Reconstructions, which I just saw my wonderful colleagues included in the chat. She specializes particularly in computational textiles. And she and her colleagues are developing an exhibition in which they explore Black hair and sort of like traditions of Black hair braiding as a possible way to produce architecture and to develop processes that not only are more sustainable, but that also really redefine what architecture is in a way that reclaims more vernacular or sort of like more local approaches. And that to me was an incredibly exciting thing to see. And I imagine there will be more architects and more designers looking at these types of sort of like intersections that are just very, very ripe for rediscovery.
So Stephen is asking a question that I think would be useful. He asks, can you make more distinctions between the reuse of secondhand clothing and the idea of collections, vintage, and the other markets there are for using these materials? This is really quite interesting because there was, in the midst of the discussion with Julie, we were talking about once upon a time, a world in which clothes were passed down to generations, right? Because they were made in a different way. Sometimes they were made at home and then they were passed on. The idea of secondhand and the fact that secondhand is kind of trashy is relatively recent, and even more recent is the idea of vintage and collections. Anna, do you want to take this on?
Yeah, I hope I will be able to answer it properly. But one thing that I was thinking when I read your question is that sort of fashion houses have become more interested in having their own archives in the past sort of like 10 years. It wasn't necessarily something that fashion houses had as much because it wasn't necessarily seen as something that was sort of like value worthy to keep. And that has really been changing. And I think that has to do with the fact that sort of like our approach to vintage, as Julie was mentioning and as Paola just said, has really changed. We're starting to see used clothing and older clothing as something that can be valuable. And of course, we're also sort of starting to see fashion as something that is worthy to be in museums and to be sort of like kept for future generations. And so I think that has kind of helped the way in which we can see fashion, and also maybe the way in which we sort of like become more comfortable with secondhand fashion. But I don't even know if that answers the question properly.
But Sarah just added to the comments list the ThreadUp resale report, which is incredibly interesting. So it gives you a sense. So when Julie Wainwright talks about the real, she talks about resale. I don't think she even talks about vintage, does she? Not necessarily. I mean, I like very much the language that she uses is very clear.
Yeah, she talks about mostly resale. But obviously in the context, of course, of luxury fashion. And there are, some fashion people do have this sort of like distinction between what is secondhand and what is vintage, but I don't necessarily think that that's something that the Real is particularly concerned with. They're particularly more concerned with how can we sort of like lengthen the life cycle of these luxury items.
Mm-hmm. Then there's a question from Rhoda. How can the fashion industry stop the velocity of their seasonal shows and pressure to sell? I think they're starting to try and stop it. I mean, they're also part of a cycle that demands that they produce and sell in order to keep on feeding the beast, right? So it takes an innovative mind to really change the model. And I think that there are several that are trying to work in that direction. One of the even more galling side shows of the fashion industry, however, is the destruction of clothes. And that's something that we were discussing also with Julie Wainwright, the fact that in order to keep the scarcity going, so there's this cycle and there's this collection that used to be, I mean, it was staggering. It was like, I think 15 collections a year that were burning down the designers for the various brands. But the problem is that once the production is halted, in order to maintain the price high and the scarcity going, a lot of these garments get destroyed, don't even make it to the outlet. So there's a lot of real aberrations that need to be tackled. And I think it's almost easier to rebel openly and transform a declaration of intent, we're not going to do 15 fashion shows anymore, we're going to do just fewer a year, that becomes like a PR advantage too. And instead, it's much harder to do it behind the scenes, to do the right thing behind the scenes when you cannot really use it as leverage. What do you think about this, Anna?
No, I mean, I fully agree. I think, I mean, I also agree with the person that asked the question. The sort of like velocity with which we have fashion shows really reflects the velocity in which consumers or people in general in the industry expect fashion to be available. And that is really something that needs to be changed. And as we've said before, looking at a sort of systemic view of fashion really allows us to understand who is really driving this need for constant production. Is it actually us who wants to buy all the time, or is it companies that want to, as you were saying, Paola, that need to sell? And I think it's important to sort of like take this sort of like more global view that really question what is driving capitalism, and how we are could be both complicit and at the same time kind of victims of it.
And in fact, we have a comment from Marina that says this is becoming also a trend or a discourse, being sustainable. We see it on brands known for waste, like fast fashion, but is not reflecting on paying their employees fairly or buying from small or local sources. And they're just fishing for more buyers, as always, contributing with consumerism. Yeah, I mean, paying lip service to the idea of sustainability happens a lot, but luckily people are getting really smart and are able to look for the kind of transparency or clarity. I mean, I remember when Everlane started, and it was very innovative to kind of declare where everything came from and what a garment actually costed, what the overcharge was. Now, I don't know if Everlane was able to maintain this kind of like limpid rigor, but still, it was really interesting. It was innovative at that time, and that's what people are looking for lately. So there's a question from Anonymous. In addition to these local approaches, what about global approaches like the fiber agreement? Do we need a local approach then? Yes, well, it takes all kinds, right? But I would say that it's about context always. I'm not sure that it would be possible for certain brands to be completely local, but definitely there could be more requirements of responsibility and engagement in local cultures and in local economies when these economies and cultures and labor markets get used for a foreign corporation. This is also a gigantic question. Do you have a comment on that, Anna?
I mean, I think agreed, but also, I mean, as the person who was asking the question said, regulation, I think, is one of the most important things, and regulation that sort of takes into account the interest of citizens as opposed to the interest of corporations. And that is really where the crux is and where the sort of difficulty is. I don't really have an answer, but I think it's something that we need to keep into account, that here, like a lot of the sort of like legislation and regulation that exist for the benefit of very specific stakeholders, and this is something that really needs to change if we are actually going to create a system that is fair for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Another interesting question here is how or with whom could we address ourselves as individuals, designers to make circular fashion a fashion project and a business model? Or is circular fashion exclusive to large companies? Is it really sustainable to recycle clothes, or are more resources spent on recycling than on production? I think, there's one example in Broken Nature. It was in the big show, not in the small one, but it's by a student of, there was a course at the Angewandte Kunst in Vienna that was all about fibers and clothing, but it was run by this experimental speculative designers. And so it was not about fashion, it was really about the concept. And there was this designer, Alexandra Frustorfer is her name, she's a student, and she had envisioned this of course, completely fictional, but a plausible place where you bring your sweaters and they get, in Italian, you say dipanati, when you take the thread and you open it up and then you knit something else. It's not completely implausible, and that's completely local and small scale. I think it takes all kinds. Upcycling, recycling, and circularity are concepts. They are not economic models yet. So they can be used as concepts to create different business models, and they don't necessarily start as corporate size and corporate scale models. So I think it would be possible. What do you think, Anna?
No, I agree. And I think, one important thing from that Marie is saying is that when we think about sustainability as a concept, and as something that we were saying before, and obviously that Broken Nature in particularly really argues, is that sustainability doesn't mean only the impact to the environment. It also means that is fair to the people that are producing them, that is not exploiting, that it also has a sort of like labor and social impact. And we need to be thinking about those things as well when we are thinking about fashion, not just about sort of like the impact on the environment, because the impact on the environment, by definition, is also an impact on human lives.
An interesting question that comes from Gisela. As fashion brands constantly revisit past eras' styles as inspiration in order to design the new and secondhand market growing over time, what will the future of innovation look like? Will it be possible to identify the old from the new? And will this be important though? This reminds me of a reading from decades ago that, I'm Milanese, so I grew up in Milan, and as a teenager, I was hired to separate the buyers from the press at fashion shows. I was part of the system, and I remember I was really enthralled by it, loved it. And then I remember reading this book by Roland Barthes, the French philosopher, that's called Il Sistema della Moda. So I guess it's called the fashion system, or the system of fashion in English. And I remember that it said that nothing new can be invented anymore. There's this catalog of styles from history and from all over the world, and they can just be recomposed. I'm not sure that I agree with that entirely, because there's always new materials that can happen, and new forms and new modes of expression, but it doesn't really matter. It's the composition that makes it original. And as you say at the very end, Gisela, will this be important though? I really don't think so. I think there's nothing wrong in hashing old ideas in new ways, because they become new. And one thing that we learn in architecture and design is that the past is a way to build the present that then enables the future. What do you think, Anna?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I also wonder if this sort of this newfound importance, or sort of new place to value on older clothes and on older styles might help us change the way in which we see clothing as something that is timeless and needs to be preserved, or as something that we know that we will be able to use in 20 years, and so why not keep it and instead of buying. So I don't know, sort of change the way when we value the items that we have, because they might become even more relevant in the future.
There's another question that I like, because it also refers to the Italian experience. So from Sydney, if you too read the Fast Company article from a few months ago asking President Biden to appoint a fashion czar, I'm curious what your thoughts on that idea are. I did not read the Fast Company article. I'm just reacting to the idea. And I think that so many countries are so behind on really harnessing their creative power also as an economic force. I would say that probably the only country that values fashion in a way that is organized and effective is France. They have a general government dedicated section. Italy, for instance, that has a very strong fashion sector, still goes with this trite slogan of the Made in Italy that is also connected to Milan, and does not do anything to really give it a value and an exclusivity the way the French do. So what about United States? Well, the United States might want to appoint a culture czar before it appoints a fashion czar, because the way the government is disengaged from culture in general is kind of like incredible. Doesn't see the soft power potential of fashion, of culture, of its museums, of its institutions. So I would say I'm all for a fashion czar, but also there need to be museum czars, there need to be culture czars, there need to be people that actually know to use this whole amazing part of the American universe that is left to its own device all the time. Anna, your opinion?
No, I fully agree. I think I'm all for a fashion czar, also keeping into account that now, for example, like consulting companies are like focusing on fashion in a way that, again, in many ways benefits companies as opposed to necessarily, individual designers or individual buyers. So I think a fashion czar would be a really good way, or whomever, sort of like an entity that regulates and that keeps into account the interest of everybody and not just companies. So I agree. I'm for it.
Sorry. There's also a comment from Raul, and actually I would like to ask him a question back because I'm surprised. So you're saying, Raul, that Brazilian sustainability is becoming a way of life. Certainly it reflects the moment of transition we're going through. That is why sustainable fashion events are so important. Brazil Eco Fashion, for example, gives visibility to new brands. How do you see it in the rest of the world? Well, first of all, I would really like to understand, and you will know better, is it real or is it what we were discussing before, the paying lip service, right? Because I've seen events like that happen in India, for instance. There's a whole festival about that. I think it happens in many places. I just wonder if there's actual credibility and also accountability to the declarations, because I think it's kind of easy to manipulate data unless you have somebody accounting for it. So it's fascinating. If there's anything that you can write to us back so that we know what your opinion is, because I think it's quite important. And Fiona connects herself to Raul and says, if I may still draw from Raul's question, what is your opinion on the common argument of the democratization of fashion in connection to low quality replicas? I kind of like addressed that question before because it was asked by, it was Raul. Yeah, so you're referring yourself to the question before. I'm just against it, and I'm against it also for design. If you want to produce something with lesser plastic, lesser leather, just do your own thing, right? Why do you have to take something that's done a certain way and reproduce it in a worse way? Can't you do something that is yours and that is original? That's very exploitative and very cynical. That's what I think. How about you, Anna? Do you have a different opinion?
I think I have like a conflicted opinion about it, because I think, thinking about it also through like a systemic lens, the sort of like world of replicas is just fraught with kind of like exploitation and like labor exploitation. So in that way, because it's a system that exists without regulation, it can be really dangerous and sort of like an easy way to just exploit, particularly workers in the global South. But at the same time, I also see the sort of like luxury market and the way that, for example, places like The Real are selling this as like the sustainable solution when it's so inaccessible to a lot of the population. And so it really goes to sort of like the crux of the matter that we've been discussing and that a lot of people have been asking, this idea of how is it that sustainable, when we talk about sustainable, it's usually something that's not accessible. And I think when we speak about replicas, we're also talking about that.
But it doesn't have to be, right? I mean, in an ideal world, there would be accessible creativity. There would be accessible and inaccessible creativity. So no, nothing that we're going to tell you is the ultimate panacea or solution. No way. There's so much that needs to happen. And I'm afraid that in this day and age, replicas will continue to exist. There will continue to exist brands that drive up desire, and that make objects, such objects of desire, that people are willing to pay less for lesser replicas, and that will feed labor exploitation, both at the point of sale and at the point of production. So it is a vicious circle that can be interrupted only by a global change and shift in culture. And, we're getting towards the end, and I wanted to end with a comment from Lisset, I think is the pronunciation. She says, I believe that there's a lot to do, but it is possible. We can spread the seeds of sustainability now that we have turned our eyes to the other side of fashion. We can be change agents through our example and our practices. Everyone can do something: plant trees, upcycle cloth, say no to overconsumption, decide to be the change in the world. And that is exactly the spirit of Broken Nature. It was an exhibition that was meant for citizens. It was meant to give inspiration to citizens that would come to the show and take a look, to give inspiration to say, next time, use a biodegradable pregnancy test so you will not throw another piece of plastic in the trash. It was about inspiring them to use green burial as opposed to a zinc coffin. It's about many different small details, small things that we can do to be change agents and to be the change in the world. The opening essay to the catalog of Broken Nature starts with a quote by Buckminster Fuller that talks about trim tabs that are the little steers that are at the bottom of gigantic ships. Each one is so small that could not steer even a much smaller ship, but all together, if moving in the same direction, they can steer the biggest oil tanker. And that's the same thing for individuals. So we really do hope that you will heed this particular idea, that you can be the change agents. And Anna would like to leave the floor to you for our concluding remarks.
Yes, sorry. That was so inspiring, Paola.
I can do it if you want.
No. So yeah, thank you all so much for spending an hour with us and for your really exciting and thoughtful questions. You really gave us lots to think about. As we mentioned before, we'll be adding a recording of this event to the course over the coming days. But in the meantime, we would love to keep the conversation going. So please continue sharing with us by posting in the discussion forums. We check them regularly. And we do our best to reply whenever we can now. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you for being here.